You're listening to the Echo Ratings Eventing Podcast, the show with a light-hearted look at the eventing world, all of the big event previews, reviews, and special guests, and of course, backed up with all of the key Echo Ratings stats. Welcome to the Echo Ratings Eventing Podcast. Welcome to the Echo Ratings Eventing Podcast and the next episode in our brand new series of eventing all over the world. And this episode is all about Australia. Now, Diarm, we have a very special guest with us this time.
Yeah, I'm actually pleased that you invited me on the show for a start. And so I'm just pleased to be on myself. But yeah, it's great to have Sarah on.
Well, we should introduce her. She has ridden at the very highest level of the sport. She's been selected for 2 World Equestrian Games or qualified for 2 World Equestrian Games. She's been a 5-star rider back in the 90s, 4-star as it was then. She is now an equestrian coach, commentator at some of the biggest events in Australia. Hello, Sarah Nevile.
Hi, Nicole. Hi, Diarm. How are you going?
Oh, we are very excited to have you on the show because you know pretty much everything there is to know about Australian eventing. No pressure. Sorry, I'm just
no pressure at all
that one on you. Yeah. And we're really looking forward to getting your take on it because there is a big couple of weeks coming up for eventing in Australia. Adelaide 5-star coming up next week, and we will have the preview show for you with a couple of very special guests. Sarah will be back with us to preview all of the key combinations as well. So that will be out next Wednesday. But we're going to talk about Australian eventing as a whole and how it is different to in the UK, how it is maybe different to in the US, the different challenges and the structure that is set up over in Australia. So that's probably a good place to start because I wouldn't say I'm overly familiar with how it is structured. I know it's an absolutely enormous country. So we're going to come on to travel, but how does it work in terms of your internationals, nationals? Do you have a similar sort of structure in terms to other countries?
Yes, pretty much the same as you in the UK. We have the CNC of various different levels and then short and long CCIs as well. So it's pretty structured pretty much the same. I think the thing that makes a difference is dealing with our weather and dealing with our distances.
Yes, 2 very, very big points because
yes, we'll see weather. Weather last week in Victoria, we had 2 days of 34 and 36, and this week we're freezing because it's like 15 degrees and I've got the heater on. So it depends on where you live as to what the temperature is.
It's just mad. Talk about the weather because actually, I love to talk about the weather. Let's talk about the weather. No, in all seriousness, because there are fairly extreme conditions that don't actually make eventing that straightforward, I would say.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. Depends in Victoria. Well, Melbourne is known for its changeable weather in terms of having 4 seasons in a day, and Victoria is a bit like that itself. And so we have a spring and an autumn season, and our autumn season, which kind of begins in late February, we've had instances where there's been 40 degrees over a weekend. Now they still ran, but and of course that one particular day I remember people were leaving the venue to get home because there were serious bushfires on the other side of the state. So you have to deal with extreme heat and then decide whether or not you want to run your horses in that sort of conditions. On that particular weekend, I decided I was staying home and was quite glad I did. But because it's very difficult even to hydrate yourself in those conditions, let alone hydrate your horse.
That's hugely extreme.
Yes.
If we just talk about the seasons there for a second, so just to put that into context, you're obviously in spring at the moment.
Now, yes,
because you're going into summer, which is the winter in the UK. So if you're listening over here, just be a little bit jealous that they're going into a hot summer, whereas we are definitely not. But just so that puts into context, then autumn being in the early part of next year will kind of see the 2 seasons. And then you have a break over winter?
It would depend on what part of the country you were. New South Wales doesn't tend to break over the winter. They do over the summer, but not over the winter. Victoria, we break over the winter because traditionally, not always, depends on whether we're in drought or not, traditionally we get way too wet to be galloping across country. So to give you an idea, Victoria is about the same size as the UK, but we have 6 million people in the state of Victoria, and you have 66 million people in the state in the UK.
Wow, okay.
So so that you're much more compressed than we are. So we can actually, after Melbourne International in the long weekend in June, so that's the very first weekend of June, we have a break for the rest of June, July and August, and things don't start up until very end of August again.
Okay. What about, you mentioned the drought there. Now, it is a very real problem in Australia in terms of dealing with extreme weather, and actually hard ground would be something that is a real sort of challenge for you.
Yeah, well, I suppose the comparison is that what you would consider hard going in the UK is quite different to what we consider hard going here. And so our horses are naturally on harder going than the UK horses are virtually all the time, even in our winter. We don't get anywhere near as deep a going as you guys do, and we probably wouldn't run in that sort of deep going because we don't need to. So the soundness issues for Australian event horses are more about the concussive injury than it is about tendon injury kind of thing, and then making tendons, walking up at the end of a break and all that sort of stuff that you do in the UK and Ireland.
I find it really interesting, the difference in it, because for such a huge country, I mean, put into context, New South Wales, when we were starting to talk about droughts before we recorded this, we were talking about the size of Australia. Now, New South Wales is in a drought at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, 97% of New South Wales is in what they officially call, so the government recognises that they're in a drought situation.
And how big is New South Wales in comparison to the UK?
Okay, so for the US listeners, New South Wales is just slightly bigger than Texas. And for UK listeners, it's 4 times the size of UK.
And 97% is in a drought at the moment.
And you have to remember, New South Wales, in terms of size of Australia, percentage-wise, that's only 10% of Australia's size. The WA takes up about 33% of the size of Australia.
That's crazy. And so in terms of, obviously, there will be no watering of cross-country courses if you're in a drought.
No, they aerate them still, but no watering. And interestingly, in New South Wales, there are some country towns that are literally only weeks away from having no water.
Oh wow. Do they still run events during that period, or do they get to a point of almost I would say a regional emergency as such, and that actually other things get put to the side?
Yeah, I think fortunately most of the eventing in New South Wales isn't in the very arid sort of western half of the state. So I'm not sure that any of the events have been in or near the towns that are almost out of water. Excuse me. But certainly there've been a lot of talk about the fact that the country's so dry and it's been quite difficult. The events have still been running, and certainly there doesn't seem to have been any drop-off in numbers. Sadly, they lost Linton Horse Trials, which is also known as Goulburn, which ran at the beginning of October, and that's been running for over 20 years, and that's sadly folded. But no, fortunately, I don't think the townships that are just about out of water have horse trials near them anyway.
And we've obviously touched upon just how huge Australia is, but in terms of the travel we spoke about it a little bit on the US special, and how riders will actually base themselves in 2 different parts of the country for different parts of the season. How does it work over in Australia? Do they just literally travel for days, or do they do a similar sort of thing?
it would depend on the rider and their ability to be out of their home yard. The people who have to travel the most are the South Australians, the Queenslanders and the Western Australians. The Western Australians, obviously, they have the most travel. Now, to get to Adelaide, they have a solid 2 days of travel across the Nullarbor. The Queenslanders, depending on what part of Queensland they're coming from, they'll have, like from Brisbane, which is where predominantly most of the eventing is, around that southeast corner. They will travel 2.5 days to get to Adelaide next week. So they'll probably leave over the weekend to get there. And say from a Victorian standpoint, where I live in Victoria, my local event is 15 minutes away. When I was competing, I could travel 2.5 hours would get me to almost everything on the calendar, whether either end of the year. But I would also go regularly up to Albury, which is 4.5 hours, or across to Mount Gambier, which is the South Australian border, which is another 4.5 hours.
Okay, so that would be fairly in the hub, so to speak.
Yes, yeah. Victoria and New South Wales I think Victoria, you have less distance from all the states, but you have more people who live in New South Wales. But again, it's 4 times the size of Victoria. So,
it's quite incredible how it works in different countries. Diarm,
I'm just looking at a map. Don't disturb me. I mean, it's actually, when you're listening to Sarah talking about it, what I just had the map open, and I mean, it's fascinating just looking at the distances. And I know we don't want to go on and on about how big Australia is. I think we've kind of captured it, but looking at Western Australia and going over to Perth generally, and then that journey back across to somewhere like Adelaide, or as you say, Sarah, coming down from Brisbane, again, back across the country from the other side to Adelaide. I mean, it's incredible that, I suppose it's just something that we don't consider, particularly in Ireland. We absolutely never consider this. We can go from one end of the country to the other in probably 3 or 4 hours. We touched on it in the in the US show, and again, you can see it here. It's a challenge that we just don't really face on this side of the world. Just even traveling horses. I know just traveling horses generally, you can run into, different types of horses travel differently even, and again, they're just considerations that are coming into this that we don't deal with.
Yeah, and often I think travelling wise, we travel at night or especially across places like the Nullarbor, to keep out of the sun during the day.
What is, so excuse my ignorance, what is the Nullarbor? Is it that's really awful.
No, that's okay. It's from, if you're looking at the west coast and you're looking at Perth and you make a straight line across the country to, say, Sydney, there's a big flat plain in the middle of the country, and it's literally, I've only gone across the Nullarbor on either by air, or I've gone across on the train as a little girl, and I remember being in the train, and all day all you would see was flat, straight salt bush for hours on end. And so it's the edge of the inland aridness that is Central Australia.
Okay.
So now, Nicole's saying, okay. Is that clear to you, Nicole? Are you happy with that?
I think so. I have an image in my head. I think so, yes. There you go, listeners. If you were thinking what it is, I've just asked the question for you. Okay. In terms of numbers competing in Australia, we've already touched upon the fact that it is far less populated than, say, the United States, which it is the same size as. I think, what are the figures again, Diarm?
At the moment, and it's interesting just hearing the seasons, but at the moment you're 8,500 runs this year. But, I don't know, would you say mid-season? Certainly plenty of 2019 still to go, like in terms of events that are going to come up.
I think there's, Western Australia essentially has finished its season, so has Queensland. Adelaide will be the last event in the South Australian season. Wallaby Hill, which is 2 weeks after Adelaide. Yeah. That's the final. So that's beginning of December. That's the final for the New South Wales. And again, in Victoria, I think we have just a national level competition left at a place called Tooradin here in Victoria, and that's run a couple of weeks after Adelaide as well. So, yeah, we're heading towards the end of the season.
Probably head just below the kind of, or between the 9 and 10K mark in terms of runs, maybe closer to 10, which, interestingly, Cole, is about the same as Ireland.
Is it?
Wow.
I mean, when you look at the sizes, but yeah, in terms of national runs, you're looking at about the same amount of national and international. Really, you're about 1,500 international, and that's pre-Adelaide and Wallaby Hill, I guess, as well. But yeah, about 1,500. So probably close in on the somewhere just below that 2,000 runs in the Australian international season.
Okay, so the listeners, there will then be, so say 10,000 total runs in Australia throughout 2019. To put that into context, 69,000 runs in the UK, both national and international, and 39,000 in the US. So just shy of 4 times as many in the US over the same sort of area, which I think actually makes it remarkable, the success that Australia have had over the years. I mean, they were so dominant in the sport in the 90s at Olympic level. They took so many gold medals. I think they took 3 team gold medals in a row. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And we've got one man who was part of those medals coming on the Adelaide preview show next week, so stay tuned for that. But to have that level of success with that number of runs is just extraordinary.
It is. It's a credit, obviously, to the Australian horses, maybe the breeding, and also I wonder if it's just the wild nature, because I think Australia won their first gold in 1960, so before I was born, and that was because 3 of the team went clear across country and hardly any other teams got around. So I wonder whether that's been part of our sort of ethos, if you like, a bit wild child.
They'd be enjoying that going into Tokyo 2020.
Yeah.
Sorry. I have to say, looking forward to Tokyo 2020, and we're not going to get into an Olympic discussion right now on the podcast, but I actually think Australia are forming an exceptionally strong hand with very good horses. I mean, Chris Burton has, I think, 5 horses qualified, or 6 horses qualified even, and he could make up a team of himself. But you've got the likes of Andrew Hoy, Vasily de Lassos, who we've spoken about on the podcast previously. Kevin McNabb has got a really good team of horses. Shane Rose obviously came over for a podium finish at Pau at the 5-star over in the south of France. So there is a real strength going into next year that they would really like to get on that podium again. And actually, they were the team bronze medalists from Rio 4 years ago, or 3 years ago.
And I actually think, interestingly, that the temperatures in Tokyo would actually, and it's also a short flight, it's only about 10 hours from Melbourne to Tokyo.
They travel further for their national event, Sarah.
I know, correct. So I actually think horses that are actually based here in Australia will be better acclimatised to those sort of temperatures. And if the selectors wanted to, they could actually have a team base up in far north Queensland in the weeks leading up to it before they leave. I'm not sure what their plans are, but certainly it means that horses that are based here with people like Emma Bishop and CP Issey Miyake, who've been having such a fabulous season, they've certainly put their hand up very clearly for looking at Tokyo next year.
And actually, I'm gonna put it out there that I want to talk about her going into Adelaide preview show next week. I'm putting it out there now, listeners. We're a week ahead of it, but I'm going to claim CP Issey Miyake.
Nicole, you can't claim Issey Miyake.
I
just think that's rude. You can't claim her a week out.
I've been talking about Issey Miyake for about 5 years on this show, since the outset.
Let's talk about them now for just a second. We're not going to talk about Adelaide form because that will be on the previous show. But CP Issey Miyake, Emma Bishop have a remarkable record in terms of Echo ratings numbers as well, Derm, and that's why you have been talking about them for years.
Yeah, one of those. I think if I remember, Issey Miyake first came up probably in around the same time as Chipmunk in terms of young horses that we were looking at who had these incredible records. Issey Miyake has 23 international runs and 11 wins. And, they're still happening. Sarah, I was really sorry to hear you mention that was the last Goulburn because that is an event that, as you know, has produced some incredible results over the years. And even looking at the form from a month ago, I was looking through the 4-star short there. Issey Miyake won that. But just looking at who goes to prep their horses there and what we're likely to see at the showcase of Australian eventing in Adelaide, Issey Miyake won it, likely to go into Adelaide. I think probably Prediction Centre has her as a slight favourite. But if she's there and she expects to be there, it's going to be hopefully a big show from them. And Issey Miyake is a horse that regularly in that mid-20s, so it'll be very interesting to see them now at Adelaide. Behind her you had Hazel Shannon, Willinga Park Clifford, who we've talked about a lot, of course, Adelaide champion. Stuart Tinney was in that top group.
Amazing celebration.
It's been Goulburn has been as you say, Sarah, 20 years of it's been a big part of Australian eventing for a long time, and a lot of big names have come through there.
Yeah, and well, it's also very handily positioned only an hour and a half or 2 hours south of Sydney on the main highway that leads from Sydney to Melbourne. And it's just been very sad to see the sheer lack of numbers of people by comparison, like when you look at 10,000 runs and, Ireland has the same amount, and you look at the number of people that live in Ireland, but the number of people that live in Australia, you've got a vast difference, and we just run out of people to run things.
Yeah. The
same few run the same events year in, year out.
Yeah, it's a big challenge. And look, it's a challenge that we're seeing all over the world, and I think it's interesting to hear it. It's not an area that I think we can go into huge depth on any one single show, but it is something that we're seeing as a challenge for our sport around the world, I would say. That we are seeing a change. It's probably reflective a little bit of society in terms of as people are gravitating more and more to the cities. Certainly we're seeing that in some countries now where but it's a challenge. We've seen it in Britain this year, we've seen it in Ireland, and we've seen our smaller events struggling to get those numbers. So it's interesting to hear that it's in Australia too.
And in terms of making those events sustainable, I mean, when you talk about the number of competitors that there are, I would imagine you're talking about much smaller fields, and it's expensive to run a 4-star long. It's expensive to run a 4-star short, and they're not going to get massive entry fees from the number of people that enter them. They have to be able to make money somewhere to be able to pay for the event. But I can't imagine that's all too straightforward.
No, I suppose it's the complexity of the sport. There's so much to the sport. Like, I've started a new sport, like I'm retraining myself to become a sprinter. I have no idea why, but I decided that was a nice challenge. Yes. With my eye on
okay, we've got to talk about that in a minute.
And I think what that's taught me is just how complex eventing is by comparison to other sports. And, just to run a cross-country course, even regardless of going up to the 4-star level, short or long, you need 150 volunteers throughout a day to sit on fences. And certainly some events here in Victoria have started to say to riders, okay, what sort of time do you have free, because you're required actually to sit on a fence or pick up rails or do something to help run the event to keep it going. Like, if you're entering, you're expected to help. So
okay, well,
that's one way of getting out of it.
To be honest, anybody that talks to me about volunteering over in the UK, it is a huge thing. That the volunteer workforce of events over here is massive, and I'm a firm believer that anybody competing should also give up their time to volunteer at some point during the year. But let's go on to, because I feel like we've got a bit in depth. And I mean, it is a difficult. We could talk about sort of the future of the sport and how it can make money and the finances of it, because actually that's a really important topic of conversation. But before we sort of bring this episode to a close, can we talk about some key numbers of 2019 of Australian Eventer? Because there's one man who flagged up on the Echo Ratings database. Now, listeners who have listened to Adelaide preview shows before may recall us searching online for a certain Andrew Cooper. Now, Andrew Cooper is an Australian event rider, but he's also an English actor and model. He's not, they're two different people, but if you Google Andrew Cooper, ladies, you'll thank me for it later. Anyway, Andrew Cooper, the event rider from Australia, is having an exceptional year, and he has sort of flagged up in a lot of the Echo Ratings numbers. He's had the most runs, both national and international, 65 in total. And actually, he has been clear cross country 57 times. So he's only had 8 problems on the cross country this year. But that's actually nearly double any other rider that's competed over in Australia. So he's been having a remarkable season.
He's your Oliver Townend type.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of volume of runs.
Yeah, and I think also one of the things you'd have to say about AC, though, is that he's one of the nicest people on the circuit. He's also one of the funniest. One of the things he does to his poor Hungarian Vizsla. Yes, it does all sorts of funny YouTube clips with him. But he's, very well liked, and sadly Victoria loses him. He's based currently in Victoria, just on the Mornington Peninsula to the east of Melbourne. And he's moving to Queensland next year. So,
okay.
These moves are big, aren't they? These are actually quite, because I was looking at a lot, when you look at the amount of wins, and you look at, we've talked about the geography a couple of times, but when you look at riders can really dominate the different states, can't they? So like a move from Victoria to Queensland will see him regularly going up against perhaps a slightly different group who probably won't be delighted to have AC to go and challenge for what are at the moment ones and twos.
Yeah, well, he'll have more travelling to do.
Okay.
He'll have a different group of people to compete against, but he will have competed against them at the CCI 4-star longs and shorts, at Adelaide, at Sydney, at Melbourne.
Yeah.
He will have already competed against those. But he will be, I would guess, actually travelling into New South Wales to do a fair bit of his competing. Just the sheer size of the Queensland calendar may not be big enough for AC and what he's used to down here in Vic.
Nicole, I found a little horse to keep an eye on for Andrew Cooper.
Go on then.
I mainly just mention him because in about 3 years' time, I want to be able to do the Izzy Miyake when you try to claim a horse called a 7-year-old at the moment, and again we mentioned Goulburn, and he won Goulburn in his only international run, finished on his dressage 26.4, a horse called Manhattan.
Okay.
Just looking at his national record and his one international win, I think that could be a horse to keep an eye on.
To be honest, Andrew Cooper he's ranked 33 in the world, I think it is. He's been a rider that's been inside, I think he's been inside the top 20 on the FEI rankings, and he's very much had a number of consistent results for a long, long time. And he's yet to break into sort of the senior squad for Australia, and in terms of sort of getting a championship call up, but I've no doubt that his time will come, and it's a name that you really do need to remember. And he actually will talk about him, no doubt, on the Adelaide preview show, because he goes forward with a ride there next week as well.
Yeah, he's been on the podium there with that Evergem Perfection a couple of years ago, maybe. What was it, 2016 maybe? So yeah, he is, I think, I had a look at that Evergem Perfection now with Eliza Harvey. Good, Diarm.
That's right.
Well
nice
done,
Diarm. Through your nose. Yeah.
Let's do a couple of other key stats. Back on CP Izzy Miyake, actually, they have one of the records this year, don't they? Did Sarah, did you say they have the best dressage score in Australia this year?
25.8. That was their first phase score at Goulburn in the CCI 4-star shorts, and that actually has beaten Shane Rose and Virgil's best dressage score, which was at Canberra this year with 26.8.
So up there in very good company.
Yeah, very good company.
And Issey Miyake is always around that, which is what's going to be one of the interesting things to look forward to when we do the Adelaide show. I think they tend to be in that between 25 and 28 bracket, and that's going to challenge. That's going to be right up there next week.
Yeah.
I think there'll be our leaders after dressage next week, but we'll talk about that next week. Virgil, you just mentioned them. Shane Rose came over to Pau for the 5-star in the south of France, which was a bold move for him. I think he could have gone to Adelaide with the horse. The horse has been runner-up at Adelaide previously, but he felt that he wanted to come over, have a big performance over here, and then the horse could actually go back to Australia. And if he is selected for Tokyo next year, then he will benefit from that short journey rather than travel over from Europe. He has an opposition beaten percentage of 94%. He's had 5 international runs in 2019, so he has the highest opposition beaten percentage of any horse in Australia that have that number of runs, or 5 or more runs. So that is a big, 94%.
That's a huge stat.
Like, that is just basically, he's beaten almost everybody.
Yeah, it's not a number. Mid-90s OBPs are just not something you see that often. It's a really good reflection on what he's doing. I think what I'm really enjoying about the show, and I know, look, it's definitely a wider debate. The Kiwis face something similar, but we tend to get drawn when we think about Australian eventing. You think how often this year on this podcast we've talked about Chris Burton, we've talked about the speed. You think how many times I've told you about Vasily de Lassos, Andrew Hoy. We've talked about Kevin McNabb and what he's been doing even in Ireland. But actually, when you listen to the names in Australia, and one of those questions all the time is, what's happening in Australia? Is there going to be someone from the home continent called up to those teams? And you can hear, potentially that actually when you hear the names coming through, fine, we know Shane and Virgil and Shane has been one who has travelled back and forth, which is why he'll be familiar to everybody. But Issey Miyake and Emma Bishop, Andrew Cooper with quite a few of his, and then I'm sure we're going to talk about a couple more, Nicole, but Hazel Shannon and Willinga Park Clifford are someone that were like Adelaide champion, and Willinga Park Clifford double Adelaide champion, isn't that right? I think
yeah,
is that the
absolutely
first horse, yeah. So there's a lot of names here who we're all becoming more and more and more familiar with because they're at the very top of the sport in Australia. I think it's great to be able to shine a light on this a little bit.
Yeah, and I think we will be seeing riders coming forward to make a serious competition for team places. The likes of sort of your stalwarts of the team, so to speak, they can't sit on their laurels because they're being pushed by very hungry, young, talented people who really, really want to be the very best at their sport. And it is fantastic, especially when we then put that into context of the success of Australia at the highest level in eventing and the number of medals that they have won, both in the 90s and in recent years, and then the number of international runs and the number of people and actually the travel and everything that is involved in that. It is absolutely remarkable. I cannot wait for Adelaide next week. I am so looking forward to it because it is the final 5-star of 2019. Sarah, you're going to Adelaide, aren't you?
I certainly am.
You're behind the microphone.
Yeah, I'm more than. How do I more than go? Yes, I'm definitely going.
You're going in a leading role. You're not just attending.
Yes, I'm kind of heading up the commentary team. Yes, so we have a few new members on the team this year, so that'll be fun.
I'll just say I'm available, Sarah. I know I'm a long way away, but just putting it out there.
We'd love to have you. It would be fabulous fun.
It would be brilliant, but it is just a long way, unfortunately. One day.
And you have baby Toby to keep you entertained.
Oh, Toby would love a trip to Australia. It'd be fine.
Toby to therapist.
Nicole, it's so far away. I'm like, honestly, I went there once and I really underestimated the distance. Like, it's more than 20 hours on a plane.
Yeah.
It's a long way.
It is a very long way. Okay, so I flew I've luckily enough skied a couple of times in the US early in the year, and it's only kind of 15 hours from Melbourne to into LA. And then I went from there, watched the Worlds last year, and then I went to visit friends in the UK. And I'd forgotten how long it was to get from the UK back to Melbourne. And I was sort of halfway across going, have we not finished yet?
Are we not there yet?
But yeah, it's kind of that, are we there yet? So yeah, it can be 24 hours in a plane.
It's a long old way. It really is. Yeah. But we are going to talk more about Adelaide next week. Sarah, you're going to come back on and join us for the preview show.
Nicole, I know what comes because I've been on these with you for so long. I know that what's about to happen here is it's all about to end, and I've one more piece that I need to fill in on before we leave Australia. We have at times, and even here we've talked about a lot of our big names. I wanted to mention two stood out to me as I was having a look through this. We talked about runs. A couple of the other ones that I wanted to mention. There's been two winners. Actually, one of them in Queensland, just outside the top 100, is Matt Gask. Is it Gask or Gaske? Gask?
I think it's Gaske.
Gaske. Okay, Gaske. Matt Gaske. He currently times two. Yes, I had a look at times two. 11-year-old, and he's actually coming off the back of two wins. One at the best named event I've seen in a long time, Fig Tree Pocket.
Yes.
But 10 wins in Australia this year, which is joint highest with Andrew Barnett. So yeah, Andrew Barnett has a horse called Go Tosca, which is actually starting to an 8-year-old. Again, I mentioned that Manhattan with Andrew Cooper. Go Tosca's record stood out as well. I think he's won 1-2-2 in his last four internationals, and they're including some of the big events. Sydney's actually in there and Canberra as well. So those two riders, when we look at 2019, have they've both had big seasons and deserve a mention. And one more, Nicole, Madison Simpson. 5 wins. That's more international wins than anyone else in Australia this year, and that includes all of your big names: Shane Rose, Sonia Johnson, Emma Bishop. Stuart Tinney has, I think, 3 big wins at 4-star. But Madison Simpson has 5 Australian international wins this year.
Keep an eye out for them heading towards the end of this year and going into 2020. Listeners, we hope you have enjoyed this insight into Australian eventing on our brand new Eventing All Over the World series. We have lots more coming up for you. We will no doubt revisit the likes of Australia and the United States. That episode was out a week or so ago. You can find it at eventingpodcast.com. And Sarah, we'll look forward to welcoming you back next week on the Adelaide Preview Show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much. I look forward to joining you then.
And it's been a pleasure as always.
Thank you, Nicole. A little bit disappointed with what you did with Izzy Miyake, but I have changed quickly and I am planning on talking about Cocoa Popping Candy, a 12-year-old who's going to win Adelaide next week. I look forward to talking to them.
Who rides Cocoa Popping Candy? Dan?
Amanda Ross. She's based in Victoria. Yeah.
There we go. Yeah. Okay, well, we will be back next week with the Adelaide Preview Show, but in the meantime, get in touch with us on Facebook, find us, like us, share us, subscribe to us. You know what to do. Listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Echo Ratings Eventing Podcast. We'll be back very soon. Thank you for listening to the Echo Ratings Eventing Podcast. This podcast is available for free on iTunes, Spotify, Podcast Addict, or wherever you usually listen to your podcasts. Make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss an episode. Find us at eventingpodcast.com or search Eventing Podcast on social media.